ability to model very complex spatial and temporal landscape processes. So everything from seed dispersal, forest succession, wildfire spread, and even human development. But what these models do is produce a ton of outputs, some information overload, a lot of outputs, a lot of information. So how do we distill this down? So often when we're modeling, we are trying to sort of influence planning, policy, decision-making in some way. But oftentimes the raw outputs of these models are not in a good position to help managers make decisions, help the public make decisions, or even help researchers further develop questions and further develop the research. So what I'm going to do today is change the slide.
Maybe arrow down. All right. Mouse.
The last option.
Okay, that's it.
There we go.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, is take you through 3 papers. And what ties these 3 papers together is each of them outlines a visualization, tool, or possibility for decision-making, management and policy, and research. So each of these papers is going to explore the effectiveness and the limitations of that particular visualization tool for that particular part of the process, the decision-making, management, and research process. The idea here is to outline how different aspects of landscape change research may require different kinds of visualization, different types of tools, different processes for examining the data. So why use landscape models? Well, first of all, the processes that govern landscape succession and land change are very complex. They're spatially and temporally complex. There are changing environmental conditions, climate change, changes in precipitation that occur on a multitude of scales. So everything from wildfires spreading by the minute to climate change on a scale of centuries. So this requires some very complex models. And we want to be able to inform how we manage land. So the Forest Service is responsible for millions and millions of acres, and each one of those acres is a little bit different. Each one of those units, the national forests themselves, are a little bit different. They're tight on resources, they're tight on time, and they want to be able to manage their forests and manage their land for a multitude of different uses, everything from recreation to harvesting, and even maximizing ecosystem services. So there's sort of a shift in land management, especially here in America, towards maximizing ecosystem services. But there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty with climate change and how different management strategies might influence the outcomes. We really just don't know, especially when it comes to long-term processes like forest growth. What happens now? What is it going to look like in 100 years if we do a certain thing? Well, we're not going to know for a really long time if we're doing things right. Landscape ecology is, as I'm learning, a relatively new field. It only kind of started to, the theory started to be developed kind of in the 70s and 80s. But it's accelerated really quickly. So we have some really robust models that we can use to try to simulate forest succession, simulate land change, and even develop several scenarios for comparing how current management strategies might influence the outcomes. So as most of you know, I've been working with Landis 2. So I'm sorry if these papers are pretty specific to my research in particular. So it's a little bit of a self-centered presentation. It's a really big model, and I've only dealt with the outputs, and it took me like an entire semester to even understand that. It takes about a year, maybe more, to parameterize. So this isn't something that you just learn in a few days and then you can deal with. So I'm understanding why there are several papers on just how to deal with these outputs. So bear with me. One of them in particular probably won't ever apply to any of you unless you're working with Landis 2. But I think the principles that they use to develop LandViz when we get to it can be applied when developing other visualizations for the management part of the research process. So I've been dealing with this model, the outputs of a model, because thankfully Jelena parameterized it for me. And this is what one of the model outputs looks like. So So this is just one model output, one scenario in one of the 5 runs for it. So this is, I think, climate change, that it's a increase in temperature with less precipitation, 15% less precipitation. It models pest and pathogen spread, wildfire, wind, and land use change. This is, each one of those folders at the top of the folder contains like hundreds of rasters. And then all those ones below it, which are some of the output files. So as you can see, this is the format that it comes in. It's a lot to deal with. So I spent a lot of time last semester, as some of you know, just trying to extract the Populus tremuloides, which is quaking aspen, data from this output, visualize it, and try to analyze it. What you're going to learn today from my presentation and what I learned when going through these papers is that I lost probably like 60 hours on doing things that I probably didn't need to do because tools existed to do it. So this was cool for me to learn that other people have also had to deal with these outputs and have ways of doing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at my animation and we're going to talk about how terrible it is. We're going to break it down, and then we're going to go through all the ways there are to have made this better and more efficient in visualizing this data. So this is quaking aspen. This is my pretty terrible animation that I quickly made in grass when I was first starting to learn grass. Boulder Larimer counties, the dots that are spreading around are quaking aspen. The colors are age cohort. So this is like brand new baby aspens. This is super, super old aging trees. So what do we first notice about this? Well, I think that the color scheme is pretty terrible because there's nothing about yellow that says like more than purple to me. So I don't know why I chose that. I think it was the default, that's why. So when you're looking at this, you don't, like, you see purple and you don't think like, oh, those are babies. So I don't think it, like, on first glance, it's really telling me a lot. I feel like, I don't know about you guys are all like staring at this right now because you have to watch it several times, right? You have to watch it loop over and over and over, and by like the 10th time, you're like, oh, I can kind of see what's happening. They seem to be dispersing up to the west, right? That takes a little while to get. So you have to kind of watch it over and over and over again. Why? Because you can't really remember what happened in the beginning by the time you get to the end, even though it's only like 12 time steps. Our brain just isn't very good at processing something as like spatially kind of diverse as this. You kind of look here, you wait till you get the end and you see here, but then you don't know what happened up here, so you have to watch it again. So it's kind of a large heterogeneous space that takes us a while to process. Let's watch this through a few times. I want you to keep an eye on this area right here. This is the beginning. This is like 60, 70 years in the future. Boom, this giant patch sort of shows up. What's that? My guess is it's probably a fire, a big major disturbance. And that's why I chose to show you guys this model run. Because while I was looking at this, I was like, oh, wow, cool. Landis like put a huge fire there in one of its stochastic runs. But it took me a really long time to see that. So here's my terrible animation. How would we communicate this? How would we give this to a Forest Service regional office manager? How would we help them make decisions about how to manage the land based on our stochastic model? So here's one way. There has to be a better way than what I did. That was also very time consuming, I want you guys to know. So the issue here is that there are highly complex spatial and temporal patterns, and we're not very good at detecting change when we look at these 2D animations. Rob Scheller and his team decided to put together 2 different types of visualizing spatiotemporal data and develop this 4D statistical surface. So basically what they did was they took 2D color-coded maps, which is kind of like what I made, 2D animation color-coded maps, and 3D statistical surfaces. Put them together and make an animation of a 3D surface that also moves through time. The important thing to know about 4D statistical surfaces is that these changes in height don't represent terrain. They're not physical properties of the land. The idea here is to capture the attribute, which in my case would be age cohort, or here is, I think, above ground biomass of, I think, a pine tree in Chippewa National Forest, in a way that we can really visually understand. I have to apologize. This is actually an animation, an animated tool. I couldn't track down a video or a GIF, so I actually talked to Rob, and he didn't have one, and we tried to contact the author, but she didn't get back to us. So if I find it, I'll post it for you guys to check out. But what this does is it's going to show over the model run how above ground biomass is changing in specific areas. So as these cones grow, this is more and more biomass in that particular area, in that particular cell. What it does that's a little different is than normal like 3D animations is that it uses smoothing, so it interpolates. So if I want to see if the model gives me year 10 and year 20, but I want to see what year 15 looks like, it has a point for that. It interpolates it linearly so that when it's animated, it's very smooth. The research shows that this actually helps us visually be able to track the changes over time. They color-coded these cones by the change in the attribute value, and they added contour lines because they found in their research that it helps people differentiate between sort of the bins, the sort of groups of attribute values. Here's some more examples. The top one is NDVI over time, so the beginning, and this is kind of later in the time series. And this cool volcano lava-looking thing down below is net primary productivity, and these are both in Oregon. So at first glance, without having been able to really see the animation, I think this would be a really cool way to kind of explore my data, and might lead to like being able to see trends in space more easily and more quickly instead of having to kind of like stare at that little dots moving around. But right off the bat, I see that I think if you were to show something like this to someone who didn't have a lot of experience in modeling or didn't have any statistical knowledge, that they would probably look at that and think that those are trees growing, or that those are land masses that are moving around. And that's exactly what happened when they did show this to experts, is that one of them did make that mistake. Figured it out, but definitely on first glance, that's what they thought it was. They only interviewed a few experts who thought it was pretty cool, and one who made that mistake. So in summary for this paper, I think this is a useful tool for visualizing data. It's pretty simple. You just input the rasters. I want to grab the code and put my stuff in and see how it works. But I think that it might be something that is a little dangerous to hand to somebody who doesn't have a lot of knowledge. They might confuse that third dimension, that 3D dimension, for terrain. It needs to be tested more, and it's just not really the right system for the decision-making, management, policy-making part of the process. So how about actually communicating with managers? Well, we have these really robust models, but there's a little bit of a disconnect between the research and the actual management. So again, two of these papers have Rob Scheller on them. That was a complete accident. He just is all over the literature on landscape ecology. So Rob and his team decided to work with policymakers on developing a web-based tool to be able to really interact with these land use 2 outputs in a way that managers could make decisions. So they wanted to sort of build a participatory, collaborative process where, as they built these models and ran these models, managers could actually interact with it. But managers who don't know anything about land use 2, who don't know anything about modeling, and may not even have GIS expertise. So these were their goals when they created this tool, which is called LandViz. They wanted it to be easy to use, web-based, customizable, so each model that for each different area might have different requirements about what they want to visualize. Web-based again. They want to be able to compare scenarios, so those different climate change scenarios, be able to visualize easily what the outputs look like in different scenarios, and have extensibility and the ability to to interact and change the classification to visualize visualize the outputs for kind of task-specific questions. So what they did was they created some Python script. You send the Landis2 model outputs through some Python, pre-processes it, it gives you a link, and you send that link to the managers. It's pretty clean and easy. And this is what they see. They don't see anything behind the scenes. So they can interact by looking at the above ground biomass of Populus tremuloides. They can reclassify it here to visualize it the way they want to. And what was cool to me, the most important feature for me, was being able to visualize these disturbances. So this is a big wind event. I don't know where we are in the world here. So it might be a tornado or some sort of wind event that actually has a visible path. But when we saw in my Aspen animation that big circle that we thought, like, maybe that's a fire, LandViz would actually be like, this is when Landis put a fire, this is where they put it. We can visualize it by how many trees it knocked down. So I'd actually be able to explore where the different disturbances happened versus just sort of guessing based on where the trees are dying. It automatically generates these graphs where you can compare the biomass over time. It's just a drop-down menu. And here are some more examples of what it looks like. So you just pick the species, and you pick what you want to visualize it by, and it automatically creates these graphs. This would have been so handy for me last semester. I could have done a lot more. But what it doesn't do is, it would have been fun for me to explore kind of the outputs of Yelena's model here, but I wouldn't have been able to do kind of the high-level analysis that I wanted to do for that project. So it's just going to sort of create these graphs and help me visualize. I can get some numbers out of it, some quantitative values out of it, but as far as like doing anything really high-level, I'd have to extract the information and still analyze it in my own way. It doesn't help you actually manage the land. So this is a tool. The managers aren't going to be able to look at this and say, oh, well, we need to thin the forest here. So it's not going to fix problems. It doesn't have the ability to directly interact with the model. So if you say, oh, I want to do a big clearing here, let's see what the model says when we do that, you would actually have to go take that back to the modelers, have them rerun the model, and then put the outputs back in. So it doesn't talk directly to the model. It's just a tool for visualizing the outputs. And the most important thing is that the uncertainty may not be properly reflected. So this is a stochastic model. It is a big model, and it's spatially explicit, but that doesn't mean that it's every cell. It means that that's exactly what's going to happen in that cell. There's stochastic variation. That wind event is just a potential thing that the model said could happen. There's a likelihood of that happening in this place. It doesn't mean there's going to be a tornado here in 70 years. So that's an important thing to remember. So uncertainty is something that's really important to reflect when you're communicating with stakeholders, and how you visualize your data and how you reflect that uncertainty really has implications in how people interpret and make decisions based on those visualizations. So if we want managers and we want people to be making decisions based on our data, which we do, hopefully that's why we're here, is to hopefully change the world, we want to make sure that we're careful about how we represent the uncertainty. So LandViz, just to sum up, it's a good option for bringing people together around a complex model and communicating, but it may not be the best for actually making and implementing decisions or doing any high-level analysis. So on the uncertainty thing, how does representations of uncertainty influence how we make decisions? Well, there's making decisions based on a map is a lot different than just reading it and interpreting it. There's a little bit more cognitive processing that happens. So this experiment that I looked at decided to try to evaluate how we interpret wildfire risk as visually displayed and how we make decisions based on those visualizations. It was a pretty simple experiment. They used a bunch of grad students in Australia. They had 5 different options for visualization, and they were paid to do it, which is kind of a key point in this one. So there were actual stakes. I know $7 doesn't seem like a lot. Maybe it does for grad students, like these people were, but they made $7 just to do the experiment, and they had the option to make 10 cents every time that they made a, quote, correct decision. So they were shown a map. I'm going to go like a few minutes over.
You still have time.
I do?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. So they were shown a map, and the map showed wildfire risk They looked like this. Different levels of risk, so like 80 to 100% your house is going to be burned, 70 to 80% your house is going to be burned. And they had to decide, am I going to leave my house or I'm going to stay? The house either was like automatically burned or not burned based on that probability. So this meant that if let's say the house burned, or there was an 80% chance the house would burn down, so you decided I'm going to leave, then it didn't burn down because there's like that 2 out of 10 chance that it wouldn't, then you were wrong. So making the right decision means staying if it didn't burn and leaving if it did burn. So there's still the chance to make the, quote, correct decision based on probability and get the wrong outcome because of the probability. So every time you made that correct assumption, you made 10 more cents. I think they had the option to make like $15 or $16. It doesn't seem like a lot, but but in the literature, it's just basically backed up by literature. If you give people money, it creates stakes. It's a proxy for stakes. It's not the same thing as like losing your house, but even having some kind of incentive to perform on a task is enough to make people actually, try really hard to not have their house burned down or not make 10 cents. They ran 3 experiments. In the first one, they were given 30 seconds. In the second one, they were given 5 seconds. And experiment 3, they were given 30 seconds, and they had to memorize a random sentence at the same time. They were just trying to make the task harder. They're trying to distract people while they were trying to make a decision under conditions of uncertainty. So I know you guys all 100% read the paper, but pretend that you didn't. So if you had kind of unlimited time, which do you think would be the best visualization to make a decision about whether you should leave your house or not? Like, what would you prefer? You guys like B?
Yeah. It's the winners. We kind of know the answer.
You do know the answer. Well, B was the winner for the time pressure.
Yeah.
So what they found was actually when you weren't under time pressure, people still actually took the same amount of time. They only take 3 to 4 seconds to make the decision. But when they had 30 seconds, they preferred the text. They'd actually rather read. Because when you read, you need a little more time to kind of process, but it kind of seems more concrete, right? So your house is located in the 80% to 100%. You don't actually have to look at it in space and see, oh, which little part is it located in. But when they were under time pressure, when they only had 5 seconds, even though we all only take 3 to 4 seconds, that's when the color cue was the best outcome. But the way normally we think about using a map like this, and when we're making visualizations, is that's not really a correct way to represent sort of the different stages, right? So like it kind of makes it look like there's more of a difference between the different values than there is. So I feel like a lot of people who know visualizations would say that's not a great representation of the different levels of uncertainty here, but it actually helps people make the more correct decisions in this particular case. And then experiment 3 was apparently just too hard. People could not make correct decisions while they had to memorize another sentence. And their correct outcomes were actually no better than they would have been randomly. So you have to not stay focused when you're making decisions that are important. I think that's a good lesson. This is obviously a very highly simplified experiment. Normally our decisions wouldn't be as binary as to just stay or leave. It would have to do with when, what to take with you. Do you want to protect your house? There's obviously a lot more at stake here. But I think it does illustrate a little bit how sensitive making decisions is to very small differences in how uncertainty is represented in visualizations. So in conclusion, I know that these papers were kind of specific to my research, and they were a little bit different. But overall, I just wanted to emphasize that visualizations for, while we're in part of the research process or in the management and policy-making process or the actual decision-making process are going to look very different. They have very different requirements, and we need to consider the conditions that we're putting people under when we're presenting these visualizations. That's all. Thank you. Questions?
For the first paper, do you have anything that we can see?
I really want to. Rob says we're both emailing the lead author on the paper, and hopefully she'll send us something.
Yeah, Rob is the okay.
He's not the lead author, and he's like, oh, I'm glad that you're using that. He's like, but I don't have the file on it. So we're emailing Helene, Jenny, I think, see if we can get it. So I'll post it when I get it because I would like to see it. Like I'm picturing these like little cones like moving around, and it seems cool.
It's very similar to what Helena does with water flow.
Yeah. Those visualizations reminded me of some of the things that I've seen her present.
So this was published, I mean, the 4D paper was published in 2014. I mean, this kind of technique was being done in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the revelation from the paper?
I took it away as that the 3D, the smoothing interpolation was different, and the color coding and the contour lines. So I mean, from what I understand, like the way that they developed it was different than what had been done before because it was like not just moving from one step to another, but it was interpolating in between, and that helped people process and be able to move their attention and understand change a little bit better. That's what I took away from it. So, but I'm not, an expert in the area.
I mean, so this was published in the Earth Observation and Remote Sensing. So maybe it was novel. The application
for the application, maybe
to forest ecosystems, and then they interviewed some experts. Well, that was very anecdotal stuff, though.
Yeah, it was. There wasn't a lot of testing of that one.
Other people, yeah.
Question. I missed this in the paper, but for the last one, with the probabilities in your house location, was like where your house located within that probability area, did that affect, like was it like if you're closer to like a lower probability area and you were on the low end of the...
I don't think I read anything in the paper about that. They moved the location of the house around. Every single test subject, I think, got to see 90 different iterations of it. Yeah. So I think they just gave it like a distribution of like you got to see an equal number of your house in like different places. So as far as like did that influence outcomes, I didn't see anything on that, but that's really interesting.
It seems like that would be important, like seeing spatially where you were would be important for decision making. Yeah, the distance to the lower
coding
area. Like versus the text. Seems like it would be important to see spatially where your house.
Yeah, like are you closer to like the really bad part or
or closer to a lower probability area.
But I mean ultimately it doesn't matter, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're closer to a lower or higher probability area. What matters is the probability
of
you are.
The visualizations that they used, it seemed like there were some, I couldn't really understand, they didn't talk a lot about how they determined those encodings and like for example the texture, like is that gonna, so this figure has the house in a bunch of different places, but how would it look for one position for all, like.
You mean if the house was like here or here?
Yeah, I mean, well, for one thing, with that, there's not a lot of contrast between the background and the thing they're using to market. And
like how do they choose that particular texture?
Yeah, even so, is this for the same probability? Because like look at E versus C and B, where they have these sort of blobs, but E doesn't have any encoding in that area where they have that sort of blob on the upper right.
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
Oh, there's dots there. It's just not showing up very well.
Okay.
Yeah, it is really hard to see. There's really faint dots. We're probably like down here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's not showing up very well.
Where was this published? Not in a visualization journal for sure. So they would have spent more time talking about how they picked out. I mean, it's
a GIS journal.
I see. Yeah. It's a neat study design, and they obviously had like a couple $1,000s to throw at the subject.
At some grad students. Yeah. It's Australia. Who knows where they got it?
Cheap, and I'm like, no, not cheap for the study, but yeah, for the students. I mean, $10, but still, hey, that's great, right? And it's a lot of. But yeah, I think I would say. Like, there's a lot to be pulled apart as far as their choices for the visualization that I don't know that we can generalize these results as much as they seem to be implying. Like, for one particular choice of color hue and for some choice of color value, so forth, it's but it has a lot of room for future work, and it's interesting.
Yeah, it definitely does.
I love the questions that they were thinking about, like in terms of like working under decision making, that aspect of how a visualization affects decision making. They were pulling that separate from.
Yeah, that was really interesting too.
Because usually it's a very basic task. Is it what value do you think it has here? Like you'd have to pick a number or something like that, as opposed to like, well, what are you going to do with this data? And then the time pressure was.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me that we didn't take a different amount of time to make the decision, but just knowing that there was a deadline actually did change how we interpreted it. So yeah, and I felt the same way. Like, I don't think it speaks to like what these exact visualizations do, but I think it does illustrate that the way we make decisions is sensitive to the type of visualization and the conditions that we're under. So I see what you mean about like generalizing for like the specific choices that they made.
Yeah.
But it did tell me something about like that it is important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else? I guess we were running out of time.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for staying.
No, it was actually we were just late starting. Your timing was fine. All right, so I don't know if you paused the recording.
Thank you.
Yeah, stop that.